Dr. Kinzer. I am
Wait,
so happy.
stop. I've gotten in trouble for that.
Have you?
I'm only an honorary doctor. So how about Mr. Kinzer or Professor Kinzer?
Professor Kinzer.
Okay.
It's a pleasure to have you here. It's an honor. And as far as I'm concerned, with your research and everything that, on all the work that you've done, you may as well have earned that postdoctorate title. So
I'm a
um,
doctor of journalism.
there we go. I'll take it. It's a pleasure to have you here, and it's an honor. And I'm so excited to talk to you. Congratulations on your recent testimony in front of Congress, right?
Yes.
And can I ask how that was? What was it? What was that like? Is this your first time doing that?
Yeah, I'm not a normal presence on Capitol Hill, but you're right. There was a task force of congressmen that, or members of Congress, who are seeking the declassification of federal records,
Hmm.
and one of their interests is MK Ultra, which was one of the most secret projects the U.S. government ever embarked on.
Hmm.
Uh, and they wanted to know from me what I thought might be possible areas for future research. How could we go about finding more information
Hmm.
about that project that reached its peak in the 1950s? So we had an interesting conversation, and I gave them some ideas. Let's see what they produce.
Yeah, I noticed you seemed very hesitant to make any speculations. Even during some direct questions, you're like, I, I don't know. Who's to say? And I thought that was so well mannered.
Well, it has to do with the way I operate, and also with my book about MK Ultra, Poisoner in Chief. So
That's right.
I don't involve myself with speculations. I was a journalist. I worked for the New York Times for more than 20 years, and I was trained only to write about what I can prove. In all of my books, including Poisoner in Chief, my favorite chapter is the footnotes.
Mm.
Everything in there is researched. It comes from somewhere. So, for example, writing about MK Ultra and CIA mind control efforts, people ask me about Sirhan, or maybe the Unabomber.
Hmm.
All of these are interesting subjects, but it's all speculation, and I'm not against speculation. Speculation is often what starts a process that leads to truth, but that's just not my business.
Right. Okay. That's a wonderful clarification, and I appreciate that. So we're going to discuss Poisoner in Chief, and we're going to discuss because it makes such an incredible topic and one that rings true. I feel to anyone that reads it today. Even though when you publish it almost a decade ago.
No,
Um,
it's just a couple of years ago.
Oh, just a couple years ago. Well, it rings true to people because I feel like a lot of people feel like a lot of social media and people's addiction to their phones and the way that content is kind of dispersed today and so almost algorithm and so individualized might allow for some room over there for the program to have potentially continued. Again, that's speculation. There's nothing there with that. Yeah.
Well, you can argue that although the kind of mind control that MK Ultra was trying to accomplish of blowing away someone's brain and
Hmm.
implanting some new brain in there didn't work, that in the modern age, social media, algorithms, advertising, manipulation of opinions is maybe even a more effective form of mind control.
Right.
And
Totally.
it works
Totally.
on a large basis. So MK Ultra was aimed at finding ways to control the minds of individuals.
Hmm.
What we have now is looking at ways to control the minds of entire populations, which is a wholly another level of ambition.
Yeah, yeah, it really is, and I'm sure that there's some kind of give and take that comes from both ends of that. Like an individual, there's certain techniques that may work better that wouldn't work for a mass crowd, and vice versa. That's why you have a lot of people slip between the cracks in any kind of mass system, is because it doesn't inherently work for everyone. Um, I want to get started with a little bit of context because I think that context is very important. And people just hear, oh, the CIA tries to mind control. It kind of caused all sorts of wacky conspiracies, and some of them might be true and founded, some of them less so. But I think the context, the general cultural and global context at the time makes a huge difference, particularly when it comes to the actors and it comes to the people behind this as ways to justify being in a position of being a public servant and then doing the opposite of that, essentially.
Well, you're right. So you need to understand what was happening at the time if you want to understand why MK Ultra emerged.
Mhm,
So MK Ultra was an effort to try to uncover the secret of mind control. How do you
mhm,
make somebody tell the truth if they don't want to tell the truth? How do you make them do what you want them to do, even if they're morally opposed to doing that?
mhm,
And this involved a lot of horrific and even deadly, bloody experiments on many unwilling subjects. So it was uh, the most intense series of experiments on human beings that have ever been conducted by any U.S. government agency.
mhm,
What could have justified that? Well, you put yourself back in the early 1950s when this project was launched. We were then in the intense phase of the Cold War.
mhm,
It was widely believed in Washington and as a result in the rest of the country that the United States was engaged in a life or death face off with the Soviet Union. That
mhm,
ultimately there was going to be a conflict and that only one could emerge victorious.
mhm.
If the Soviets were to win, that would not only mean the defeat of the United States, it would mean the end of any possibility for meaningful human life on Earth, because every human being would be turned into a kind of a robotic automaton controlled by commissars in the Kremlin.
Mhm,
So, if you consider the stakes to be that high,
mhm.
the loss of a few lives or a few hundred lives would seem like a very small price to pay. Unless you understand the intensity of that era, it's impossible to understand how a US government agency could have carried out such a horrific project.
Sure. And one thing, and I don't want to. I'm going to use this example just to draw a parable, but not to really comment on it. But I would say that, for example, the most recent war America's in with Iran was I don't think that the population felt or understood the purpose or the goals or the intention going into the war perhaps as clearly as Washington would have liked. Was the rest of the country at this point around the time of the Cold War, was everyone bought in on the idea that the Soviet Union won, that this was going to happen, or was this kind of political conversation that the top people in the top tier were generally having among themselves?
I think many Americans did believe it, and the reason
Mhm.
they believed it is what they were told by their government officials and the press, which was almost unanimous.
Right.
Um, in the case of Iran, there is a kind of an interesting comparison. Uh, American public opinion has been softened up for a war on Iran for years with this
Mhm,
repeated mantra that Iran is the world's leading sponsor of state terrorism, that it threatens all its neighbors. All of this is absolute nonsense, but it's been repeated so many times that
mhm,
we have this stereotype: Iran, evil, terrorist. Despite all of that, many Americans seem very unhappy with the fact that we are in this conflict. Now, going
mhm,
back to MK Ultra, um, even though Americans recognized what they thought was the intensity and the life or death um, stakes in
mhm,
this US Soviet confrontation, would they have gone so far as to support a project like MK Ultra?
mhm,
So in Iran, we can say many people maybe got this idea that Iran is evil, but not so much that we had to go and make a war on them.
mhm,
But back in the 1950s, this wasn't possible because although we did recognize or believe the ideas about the Soviet Union that we were being told from Washington, nobody knew that MK Ultra was underway. Not just
right.
ordinary Americans. No US senator or congressman had any idea this was going on, and that also included most people inside the Eisenhower administration and even most people inside the CIA.
Yes.
So there wouldn't be any way for Americans to say this was excessive because they didn't even know it was happening.
Right, right, right. And one thing in particular that seems kind of scary, and it's funny. I really liked the show Homeland. I thought I couldn't even believe that it was allowed to even air, at certain points. But there's certain concepts, and I think, and I've heard you either talk about it in a previous podcast or perhaps write about it in your book or both, that sometimes information is bad, and sometimes intelligence agencies, even within their own agency, will go on a quote unquote rogue type of mission for the sake of national security, and you know what? It's better to apologize than it is to ask for permission a lot of times. And this takes that
Absolutely.
to the next level, it feels like.
So, it's definitely true that in the CIA and in intelligence services in general, ignorance is sometimes considered an asset.
Mhm.
You don't want to be compromised by knowing too much. And this really fed into MK Ultra in several ways. So, uh, there was no official oversight of MK Ultra. The guy who ran the program, Sidney Gottlieb, didn't have to report to anybody. Nobody ever went over the protocols of his experiments, and I think there was a reason for that. Nobody wanted to know what he was doing. A couple of people at the highest levels of the CIA, including Gottlieb's sort of godfather in the agency, Richard Helms, had an
Mhm.
idea that these were very bloody and horrific things going on. And that's another reason why they didn't want to know about them. But
Mhm.
there's another interesting piece of this, and it has to do with Gottlieb himself, the chemist who was brought into the CIA to direct
Mhm.
MK Ultra. So at this time in the early history of the CIA, just about all of the senior officers fit the same profile. They were all white Protestants from the Northeast, mostly. They went mostly to the same prep schools, the same Ivy League colleges. They
Mhm.
dated the same girls. They joined the same golf clubs and the same yacht clubs, and they worked at the same investment banks or Wall Street law firms. Uh, they were quite an inbred group.
Mhm.
Now, when it came time to find somebody to run this horrifically brutal project, the senior officers of the CIA chose someone completely different from them. So Sidney Gottlieb was Jewish. He was the son of immigrants from Central Europe. He went to
Right. A big
Hebrew
no-no back
school,
then,
had a
right?
bar mitzvah. He went to city college instead of Ivy League schools. He limped. He
Mhm.
stuttered. He was so different from all the other officers at the early CIA. And I think this was not an accident. It's quite possible that in the minds of the senior CIA officers, there was an understanding
Mhm.
that whoever took this job was going to have to torture and kill people,
Yeah.
and it'd have to do so in really bloody, awful ways. They didn't want somebody in their group to be responsible for that, not
Mhm.
just because they didn't want to compromise that person, but also because of what might happen later. If there was some time when MK Ultra was revealed,
Yeah.
and then there were people like us talking about what MK Ultra was, the CIA could then say, we didn't know what he was doing. And in
Mhm.
fact, this is exactly what happened. One of the families of one of the victims uh, of MK Ultra came in to see Rich, the CIA director William Colby.
Mhm.
After this was late after the first revelations about MK Ultra, and Colby told them some of our people were out of control at that time. There was a lack of supervision. He was right, but that
Mhm.
wasn't an accident. That
Yeah.
was the point, to
That's a
allow
message.
Colby 20 years later to say that.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, and what's interesting is that you would I would I don't know what I would think, it's always impossible to get in people's head, but Sidney Gottlieb seemed, or at least on the record, felt betrayed at the end of the day and felt like, "Hey, my name happens to be, surreptitiously the only name that's on here, and what's going on with that?"
Absolutely. When he was brought in front of congressional investigators years later, he did complain that there have been declassified documents about MK Ultra that are incriminating, and all the other signatures have been blacked out, but mine is left in there. So that sort of confirms this idea. Let's dump it all on Sydney.
Yeah, yeah. I wanna talk about, because I think one of my favorite parts of the book and something I was really that I'm typically more curious about and excited about was the relationship between Sidney Gottlieb and George White. And George White is a heck of a character, and together, they went to I believe they spent time in one of my favorite places in the world in history, which is, West Coast San Francisco in the late '60s. So can you tell me about that a bit, please?
So George Hunter White was a federal narcotics agent.
Mhm.
He was also kind of a wild personality. He was short and enormously fat, bald-headed. Uh, Somebody wrote that he looked like an extremely threatening bowling ball. Um, he was also a guy who sampled all of the drugs that he confiscated. He never found a drug that he didn't want to try himself. He had a wild private life. Um, and he hooked up with Gottlieb
Mhm.
on a really bizarre project. So they came in contact because both of them were interested in drugs and the way drugs are used.
Mhm.
Gottlieb also was a drug user. By his own account, he used LSD more than 200 times.
Which I
Uh,
can't fathom, by the way. It's crazy.
um, Makes you wonder if that's how he invented some of these crazy
Uh-huh.
experiments. Um, but then
Mm.
Gottlieb got this idea that among all the different ways he was testing drugs, maybe he'd like to see if there was some way people could talk more freely, or you could somehow find some new insights if you could combine sex and drugs.
Mhm.
So, with George Hunter White's help, Gottlieb set up a little bordello in New York, and then later a larger one in San Francisco.
Mhm.
So he actually had a national security whorehouse overlooking San Francisco Bay, and George Hunter White was in charge of running it.
Mhm.
So he had a stable of women, including women that sometimes he busted for drugs, and then he would tell them they could get off if they only came to work for him for a while. And these women would be told to pick up men and bring them back to this apartment that Gottlieb had rented and decorated with like Toulouse-Lautrec paintings and black lace curtains. And the idea was they'd have sex with the men, and then uh, the men would be fed a drink, and in that drink would be whatever drug or drug combination Gottlieb wanted to test that
Yeah.
day. Meanwhile, this enormously fat George Hunter White would be behind a one-way mirror,
Mhm.
sitting on a portable toilet, drinking martinis out of a pitcher, and watching. Now,
Mhm.
George Hunter White was not a scientist. He was not a psychologist or had any knowledge about sexology. So this was not scientific. It was just a kind of a crazy project. They came up with the amazing insight that sometimes men will talk more freely after sex than in other cases.
Yeah,
Um,
great.
so nothing of any value came out of this, except later on while I was researching Poisoner in Chief.
Mhm.
I did come up with one possible reason why Gottlieb would have thought that having a bordello in uh, San Francisco would advance national security purposes or would be positive for anybody. And it was
Mhm.
this. So while I was researching Poisoner in Chief, I found a lawyer who had been involved in a case decades earlier and had cartons full of old documents in his garage out on Long Island. I
Mhm.
went out to visit him, and in there were a couple of depositions, including a deposition by another drug agent who was George Hunter White's assistant. And
Wow.
this guy said so Gottlieb used to come out and visit us and check on this project all the time. The
Mhm.
project was called Operation Midnight Climax. Uh, and he said every time Gottlieb came, he wanted a girl. He was right away. He wanted to have a girl, then he wanted to have another girl. And I always supplied him with women, and they never charged him because they did it as a favor to me. This is what
Mhm.
I read in the deposition. So that made me think now, that is a reasonable explanation of why a middle aged civil servant would want, if he had the money and the US
Mhm.
government approval, to set up a place where he could go and enjoy himself. So he's telling his associates and his family he's going off to San Francisco on business, which it was. But the business also involved something very satisfying and personal for him. So maybe that was the whole reason behind it. These are the questions that never got to be asked because Gottlieb was never really questioned ever about MK Ultra.
Yeah, or at least not for the record, or not in any kind of hardball way, I suppose. Yeah, I my immediate response to that would feel like to a guy like Gottlieb, especially someone that seemed relatively balanced, although obviously he seemed to have two very extreme sides to him, that he would potentially risk his entire career over opening a brothel essentially in San Francisco just to get laid.
If anybody knew about it. But
Right, right.
Gottlieb lived in total anonymity.
Yeah, it's
When I was
crazy.
writing the book about him, Poisoner in Chief, I really felt like I was writing the biography of a person who didn't exist. So he never had any fears that anything he did would be discovered. Let me tell you, if all of Gottlieb's infractions and
Mhm,
crimes could be listed,
mhm,
running a whorehouse in San Francisco would be way down at the bottom. There were a
mhm,
lot of things that were hugely worse than that. And if he
mhm.
could get away with all those things, I don't think anybody would have lifted an eyebrow about the San
Yeah.
Francisco Midnight Climax project.
Certainly not. And what I think is, and you touched on this, even though I thought this was incredible, the MK Ultra program ultimately kind of created the hippie movement, the Grateful Dead. They created the Grateful Dead. It created that summer of love, and you don't touch on this. I don't believe as much in your book. Tom O'Neill and Chaos touched a little bit more on this. That that it seemed that the amphetamines that raged through San Francisco that kind of put an end to the summer of love and that whole peace, love, and whatever music era rather, the amphetamines that raged through were also distributed from the San Francisco Free Clinic, which was that same place, that same CIA cutout that MK Ultra was operating out of. No.
There was an overlap between that clinic and the CIA because the guy in charge of it was also working with MK Ultra. But the other piece that you mentioned earlier is much more clearly documented, and that has
Yeah.
to do with probably the most unexpected result of MK Ultra. So Gottlieb was probably by the end of his career knew more about drugs and toxins than any human being on earth.
Mhm.
As soon as he heard about LSD, which had just been fabricated or discovered in Switzerland,
Yes, Albert
he was
Hoffman.
fascinated by it.
Yeah.
It was so effective in such small doses. It was colorless. It was odorless.
Mhm.
At one time, he thought that it might be, as one of his associates put it, the key that could unlock the universe. In other
Mhm.
words, the real key to mind control. So Gottlieb at one point arranged for the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD. That was in 1953. And Sandoz, the Swiss pharmaceutical
Mhm.
company, was happy to get rid of it. It was causing them too much trouble, so they dumped it all on the CIA. So, what did Gottlieb do with his big supply of LSD? Well, he had several uses for it. A lot of it was used in coercive experiments on
Mhm.
unknown knowing subjects. For example, although we don't have many clues about individual MK Ultra experiments, we have uncovered several, and one of them has to do with LSD. At the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky,
Mhm.
7 African American inmates were segregated and given what were described in the protocol as double, triple, and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days. Presumably, the goal of this was to find out if such a massive overdose of LSD could destroy a person's mind, which
Yeah.
was Gottlieb's goal, because he
Yeah.
believed that before you could put a new mind into somebody's brain, you had to destroy the mind that was in there. Now, we don't know the results of that experiment, but I'm guessing the answer is yes.
Right.
With that much LSD and that intensity over that long a period of time, it might destroy your mind.
Mhm.
But what I always ask myself, and I still can't get past, is what happened to those 7 guys?
Yeah.
Did they ever know what had happened to them? Did they think they went insane? Did they die? So we have no idea.
Yeah.
Now, that was part of what Gottlieb was doing with LSD, conducting these horrific experiments on unwilling subjects. But he also had another interest, which is how would LSD affect an ordinary person in a clinical setting who knows that he's being given a psychoactive drug?
Mhm.
So he wanted to carry out tests in clinics and hospitals. CIA does not operate any clinics or hospitals, so he had to use those that already existed. The CIA could not approach those hospitals, but Gottlieb set up a couple of bogus foundations with little letterheads. And
Mhm.
he mailed out letters to hospitals and university clinics all around the United States. And he told them, we have this new psychoactive drug, it's LSD, and we'd like you to test it for us. And the deal would be we give you the LSD, you advertise for subjects, you tell them exactly what it is. And then you write up reports on how they react, and we pay you for all of this.
Mm.
So it seemed like a great deal for a lot of hospitals, and many of them bought into it, having no idea that these foundations actually were bogus and it was really the CIA.
Mhm.
So, who were among the very first people who read those ads and signed up? Well, one of them was Allen Ginsberg, the poet, who went on to become one of the great promoters of LSD for the rest of his life.
And
He was
counterculture
listening
hero.
to uh, Tristan and Isolde and Gertrude Stein on his headphones while he was tripping on LSD. Another one was Ken Kesey, the
Yes.
author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which became kind of a Bible of the counterculture. And I found
Mhm.
an interview while I was writing Poisoner in Chief with Ken Kesey, and he had a very interesting comment. He said, I worked in a mental hospital to gather information for the book that became One Flew Over the Cuckoo's
Yeah.
Nest. But that was just an accident. That wasn't the purpose that I went to work in the hospital. I just figured that out once I got the job. The reason I got the job was so that I could break into a pharmacy and steal the rest of the LSD, which he did, and then brought it back to all of his friends. Another early volunteer was Robert Hunter, the
Yes, the
songwriter
Grateful
for the
Dead writer.
Grateful Dead. He
Yes.
also took LSD home. He brought it to the dead and to their circle. So essentially, this is how LSD leaked out into the general population. So the
Mhm.
irony, of course, is that the drug that Sidney Gottlieb hoped would give the CIA the power to control the world wound up fueling a youth generational rebellion that was
Yes.
aimed at destroying everything the CIA stands for.
Yes. Yes.
While I was writing the book, I also came across an interview with John Lennon. He was
Mm.
asked about LSD, and he said, we must always remember to thank the CIA. Now, he had never heard of Sidney Gottlieb. Nobody had.
Yeah.
But if he had, he would have said, we must always remember to Sidney Gottlieb. He is the first LSD guru.
Yeah. 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 It is it's truly nuts. It's mind-boggling, especially because, like, it is so defiantly anti its origin, you know? I mean, it's such a it's Shakespearean. I think it's such a crazy twist of fate, and one thing that I wanted to actually kind of drill home that, you mentioned earlier was these agencies are huge. And a lot of times, a lot happens in different vacuums within these agencies. So I bet that while one agency is off feeding LSD, one part of the agency is off feeding LSD to all these hippies, the other half is trying to figure out how do we stop these hippies from, from doing all this, and where's this all this LSD coming from, and how's this happening? This,
Certainly, I don't think the people who began the anti-LSD campaign, which really reached an intensity under the Nixon administration,
Mhm.
had any understanding of how LSD had become such a mass phenomenon, because even they were unable to penetrate what MK Ultra was. I think probably Richard Nixon would not even have recognized the acronym. It was
Mhm.
that secret.
Wow, it's crazy. So when you write all this and you're doing this research and you put this all into a book, how does this change your perception of reality, of your life, of the world that we live in? Because it's funny. I did a couple of interviews with John Perkins, who's the author of The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which is an awesome book. And he was a great guy. And he is a great guy, rather. And one thing that I noticed was a lot of the things that he would talk about 20 years ago almost seemed prophetic, but you could kind of, like, looking back at history, you could kind of see how the present is being forged. But then when the work that you're doing, it almost feels like there's too much chaos to keep track of, and like, and everything kind of seems all over the place. How does this affect your perception of things?
Well, first of all, writing this book was an intense experience because when you're writing a biography, you're essentially living with the person that you're writing about. And
Yeah.
my office is pretty small, so it was close quarters. And living with Gottlieb for a period of years was very unsettling.
Hmm.
Some of the stories that I discovered were really personally affecting. How can you not be overwhelmed by some of this stuff?
Yeah.
Um, so in that sense, the writing of the book was an intense process for me. But you asked about how it affects my wider view, and I've come to this conclusion: we live in an era in which ordinary people don't believe much of anything from the government, and conspiracy theories run wild. One lesson about MK Ultra is that some of the wildest conspiracy theories actually not that far from the truth. This is
Hmm.
really actually the truth of MK Ultra goes beyond what many conspiracy theorists have been able to come up with. So why is this? Why did we get to this point where there's so little credibility and everybody believes that there's something other going on than what we see? And
Hmm.
I think it has to do with the emergence of the covert side of the covert sphere in American life. Over the years, it's been very clear time and again that what we see from what the government says is actually not what we do.
Hmm.
And that, I mean, if you look around the world, we say that we promote freedom and democracy and free choice, but we always crush governments that don't like us in real
Sure.
life. And we
Yeah.
see the same thing at home when we are always preaching certain kinds of policies, but actually our society is so unjust that it doesn't reflect any of our proclaimed ideals. And so many scandals have been unveiled in which it becomes clear that there's an entire mechanism behind the curtain or underneath the rug that we never
Hmm.
see. So
Yeah.
once people become aware of that and they realize how great is the covert sphere, it makes it difficult to believe anything.
Yeah.
And I think this is the genesis of all of this suspicion. When you research MK Ultra, as I can tell you, as one who may have researched it more than anybody, you're only a couple of clicks away from the craziest conspiracy theories, but MK Ultra itself is about as crazy as they get. And in my book, as I said, everything is a footnote. It all actually happened.
Yeah, yeah, and the craziest thing is you don't even rate whether or not it succeeded, and that's something I wanted to bring up because again I read this was one of the most unsettling. I'm bringing up chaos over here because this stuck in my head. The curious case of Jimmy Shaver. I don't know if you're familiar with that story from 1954, where there's a 3-year-old or a guy named Jimmy Shaver has apparently no recollection of, like, killing and abusing a 3-year-old girl. And, Jolly West, who you again, you kind of mentioned briefly, I believe, in the book, but I think he was a pretty big component of MK Ultra too, right? He was a pretty big part of it as well. Um,
MK Ultra had a large network of collaborators. Some of them have been identified, but most have not. And so Louis Jolon West, known as Jolly West, was a one of these visionaries who believed that drugs could be used to create a whole new, different kind of society, which, of course, the wise men at the top would design. Um, and he was in many ways off the rails, but so was MK Ultra, and he became a collaborator of MK Ultra in San Francisco, and during the period when uh, drug clinics were proliferating, and
mhm,
then later on in the period when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, West uh, promoted a whole variety of projects, including he at one point wanted to build a big sealed in camp where he could bring in subjects to be experimented on. Uh, so West is just one exemplar
but he
of
seems
this
to
constellation.
he seems to have believed that he accomplished mind control.
So you asked a question about did it succeed? Is there such a thing as mind control? Well, there's a lot of speculation, and I wouldn't take any of West's conclusions as final, but I would say this. Uh, when towards the end of the 1950s, people in the CIA began to figure out what Gottlieb was doing
Mhm.
and realizing that he was carrying out horrific experiments and essentially experimenting people to death.
Mhm.
Um, there became this disquiet at the top of the CIA. And Gottlieb recognized this. And finally, really of his own accord, he wound down MK Ultra and actually conceded that he had failed, that the idea that you can seize control of another person's mind is just a myth. It's
Mhm.
a fantasy. And I think there are reasons why they believed it. Part of it has to do with all the movies and all the books about having a little watch in
Pendulums.
front of your
Yeah.
eyes or dropping a drink and a pill in someone's drink, who then goes off and steals the documents from the embassy and all that
Oh.
stuff. Um, and so Gottlieb tried everything that he could imagine, and not just pharmaceuticals, but sensory deprivation, extreme noise, temperature extremes, hypnosis, everything to try to destroy a human mind so that he could put a new one in. And he did manage to succeed in destroying, I think, a lot of minds and a lot of bodies, but he never figured out how to put a new one in. So he concluded it didn't work. There's no such
Right.
thing as mind control. Now, he probably knew more about that subject than anyone on earth. So I'm willing to take his word for it.
Right.
However, he was right when he said it. That's already 75 years ago.
Yeah.
If we, or 65 years ago, when we think about all the advances in cyber technology, in
Sure.
artificial intelligence, in neuroscience, it makes me wonder if what was true in 1960, there's no such thing as mind control, might not be true anymore.
Yeah.
And then I ask myself, here I was writing this book in the 2020s. The project happened in the 1950s. So does that mean that there could be another Stephen Kinzer in 50 years writing about something that's
Sure.
going on now that we
Sure.
don't know about? If you were to tell me, I think the mind control idea is dead and there's no intelligence agency in the world that's carrying out research into this, I'd be very dubious. It would just make sense to me that any intelligence agency would be seeking to find ways to solve this great dilemma. Because, of course, as Gottlieb and his CIA superiors realized in the 1950s, if
Mhm.
you could find a way to control the minds of other people, the prize would be nothing less than global mastery.
Yeah.
And the thought that someone else might be trying to do it would be just another incentive for you to intensify your studies. So um, I can't write about this because, as I said, I don't speculate in
Yeah.
my books, but it just seems logical to me that experiments in this subject might well be going on in the inner sanctums of various intelligence agencies.
Yeah, I bet. I had a doctor on yesterday that I was talking to who specializes in gambling addiction in particular, and one thing that we were talking about was he goes, "You can't even compare gambling even 5 years ago to gambling today, because you have your phone and you have constant new parlays, constant new opportunities, the ability to place so many transactions in such a short window of time as opposed to putting in a bet with the bookie, waiting for the game to be over, going to get, okay, now you got to call and I got to figure out what to do with it. He goes, it's just a different universe. And it opens up the potential for our brain to be rewired in a totally different way than we've ever seen. And I think that, again, like you said, if that was what they were doing in the 50s, right? And they were using their braking technology in the 50s and 60s, what it was in the 80s, 90s, 2000s and onward. So
It's a good analogy, I think.
thank you.
What was easy or true a long time ago is not true in the new world.
Yeah. So, what are some things that you would have liked to put in the book and then couldn't? Or what are things that didn't make it to the book that you felt were noteworthy but didn't fit, like, what didn't fit in the details of it, or maybe
It
the way the
wasn't
book
that
came out?
I didn't find a lot of pieces that I thought were interesting, but for various reasons didn't put in, other than these speculative ideas that maybe somebody got this idea from somewhere. But the greatest frustration has to do with the lack of documentation about what MK Ultra was. So,
Mhm.
uh, MK Ultra more or less wound down, at least its most intense phase, at the end of the 1950s. Gottlieb spent a couple of years living in Germany, where he'd conducted many of the MK Ultra
Yes.
experiments. Then he was given a new job as head of the Technical Services Division, which is the organization inside the CIA that makes all the toys and the tools that
James Bond uses.
exactly. It's M. Well, what was his name? Q. Q
Yeah.
was the guy in the James Bond book. That was Gottlieb. Then he left. Then the scandals in the CIA began to break in the mid 70s, and Richard Helms, who had been sort of Gottlieb's unofficial godfather or boss at the CIA, was then head of the CIA,
Mhm.
and he was fired. And Gottlieb, who had worked very closely with him, went to him and was worried about the 7 crates of documents that document all the experiments and presumably all the deaths and everything that MK Ultra did. And he and Helms agreed that they should destroy all the documents. Now, this is a federal crime. It's a
Yeah,
felony,
you should go straight to jail for that, I
destroying
think.
government property. However, it's a much lesser crime than the crimes that would have been
That they were doing,
revealed by
right,
those
yeah.
documents. So Gottlieb called the CIA Record Center out in Maryland and told them to destroy this documentation, and they wouldn't do it because the archivist recognized it's a criminal violation. Gottlieb drove out there and gave him, with his own authority at the CIA, the order to destroy 7 crates of records. And the archivist actually wrote in his log, the documents were destroyed, quote, over my stated objection.
Wow.
So, so much has been lost. I think my book, Poisoner in Chief, is certainly the most complete account of MK Ultra that exists. However, I am painfully aware that I only uncovered a very small portion of what
Mhm.
MK Ultra was and what Sidney Gottlieb did. Now, some documents were later found as they were filed in a different place.
Mhm.
Um, and when I testified at this congressional committee about which you asked me at the beginning, uh, I was asked where they should be looking for new documents. And so, not having any idea whether there are any other documents out there, I told them that although I'm all for trying to search for other documents, the fact is we have a lot of MK Ultra documents that are heavily redacted. So
Oh.
we know those documents exist, but there are whole paragraphs cut out.
Mhm.
Um, and those some of those paragraphs seem might be very revealing. So it might be a wild goose chase to look for new records, but there's certainly more out there in records that have been declassified with large redactions. So that might be the first step. Let's get
Yeah,
the redactions unredacted, and that
yeah,
might lead us to other things. So, my greatest frustration in writing the book and in talking and thinking about MK Ultra is that Gottlieb really was successful. Uh, I think it was Helms who said to Gottlieb, "Let this die with us."
yeah.
And it almost did.
A lot of it did. A lot of it did. Although I would speculate that as far-reaching as the program was, and as that it's had so many inadvertent participants in it, that more data was is probably you could probably find more data than we think. I just you'd have to it might not be as conspicuous as under, MK Ultra. It might be it might be a Tim Leary, study that was going on in Harvard or something like that. And instead, and you might get more.
I did give the committee one other suggestion. So uh, MK Ultra, the most intense experiments of MK Ultra, the ones that killed people, were
Yeah.
carried out largely outside the United States. They were
Yes.
carried out mainly in countries, this is in the post-war period, that
Mhm.
were under direct or indirect American control. Therefore, there were no problems with the law. The CIA could do whatever it wanted. Um, and those included South Korea, the Philippines, Japan, and perhaps especially Germany.
Yes.
While I was writing MK Ultra, I did work in Germany. Actually, I went there and
Wow.
I found what I think might be the first CIA black site or secret prison. It's a beautiful looking chalet outside of
Well, you
Frankfurt.
went yourself there? How was
I
that?
went there.
What was that like?
Well, I found the house, which had been already described in a couple of news articles. One called it the CIA torture house. And this Der Spiegel, the big German magazine, did a piece on it and said there were deaths, but the number is unknown. So I went out, I found the house, and I found a young guy there. He's a young businessman. He's just bought the house, and he was renovating it to make it into condos. He's breaking it up into smaller apartments, and he knew exactly the history of the house. And he told me the people in the neighborhood also know. The older
Mm,
people here, he told me, have said that the people that were killed in Gottlieb's experiments were buried in the forest around here in places that are now covered over with apartment blocks and
yeah.
shopping malls. This guy then took me down into the basement where he has storage rooms, and he said these were the cells where the MK Ultra
Wow.
torturers worked with their Nazi partners, carrying out experiments that were actually just continuations of the experiments that those Nazi doctors had been carrying out in the concentration camps only a few years earlier, just down the road.
Yeah,
Um,
sorry, can you just real quickly, just explain how that like, what that was in, like, a couple of sentences before you continue, becau just in case people don't know that?
what was what?
About how these were continuation of Nazi science,
Aha.
yes.
So, Gottlieb, being a good scientist, started out his project by asking himself, who knows about this stuff? Who's already researched ways to destroy a human mind and a human
Mhm.
body? Who knows, for example, whether you need as much sarin gas to kill an infant as you do to kill an adult? We don't know
Yeah.
that because in order to find out, you have to kill people. So who knows that kind of stuff? Who knows what the body tolerance is and when people suddenly die from the certain drugs? The Nazis knew that. The torturers in the concentration camps. So the chief medical officer of the Nazi army and the chief of the Nazi bioweapons program both
Mhm.
came to work for MK Ultra. The Nazi experience in those camps was a foundation stone for MK Ultra. So, uh, while I was writing the book, I did find a memo in my research in Germany that was written by the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German Secret Service,
Mhm.
to the chancellor at that time, Konrad Adenauer. And counterintelligence officers who wrote this said that Americans are kidnapping people on German soil and they are carrying out experiments on them that are illegal under German law. They
Yeah.
sent this to the chancellor. The chancellor was very close with the Americans. It was the height of the Cold War, so he didn't do anything. There was no response to that memo. But that makes me think maybe inside files in other countries like Germany
Right.
there are reports about what
Right.
was happening. If these counterintelligence officers knew that there were experiments going on that were in violation of German law,
Yeah.
they wrote that. What were those experiments? Well, they
That's
must have
right.
found some of them. Couldn't they have written a memo to themselves about that? Wouldn't there be something in their files? So that,
Mhm.
I think, as I told the committee, could be a promising avenue for future research.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that we're seeing that being deployed in real time with a lot of the Epstein files and stuff like that. Where, okay, you know what? If it's not gonna be listened to when it's a law, and it's not gonna be listened to when it's passed by Congress and Senate, then go to other countries that they are holding people more accountable for this kind of behavior, and see what they have, and maybe you could dig something up with that. I mean, I hope that that's the case. And again, I think that the one of the few potential benefits of it being so far reaching is that there's probably way more documentation. And maybe that's what AI could be helpful with also, that like, listen, things that, studies that have been done, at X, Y, and Z colleges that are similar, in tone to this, and weed them out one at a time, a couple at a time, and see what's worth finding. But it's certainly fascinating.
There might be more out there, and foreign files is an area that nobody's ever really researched yet. But
Yeah.
again, MK Ultra is in many ways a black box. I tried to knock a few holes in it with my book, um, but I'm still grappling with the scope of it all and the effect of it all.
Right. Definitely. Um, yeah, sorry, there's so many different, directions that I could go with this. So, for the people that were listening to this, right, that say, "Wait a minute. the CIA can't legally operate on American soil. How did this experiment was there ever any kind of clarification or justification for the fact that this was being done, uh, on American conducted on American soil? You mentioned that a lot the worst of their experiments were being done outside the country, but they didn't really have the right to be able to do this in San Francisco or New York or in Harvard or anywhere else that they were doing this, right?
Or in that prison in Lexington, Kentucky.
Or in that
It
prison in
that
Lexington,
that
Kentucky.
cannot have been legal by any legal conception, and not to mention the fact, as you just said, that the CIA is not supposed to operate inside the United States. Um, but I guess the justification would have been that, the same justification that was the basis for MK Ultra. We can't be obeying rules. We're in a life or death struggle. Law means nothing. There won't be any law. There won't be any America if we don't succeed. You know, commitment to a great cause is the most powerful reason to commit immoral acts.
Yeah.
Patriotism is one of the noblest of causes. And so there's a way for you to gin yourself up and think that your patriotism requires you to abandon law and go off into areas that other ordinary people might think were illegal or horrific or immoral, but we in the CIA who really see the threats that nobody
Mhm.
else sees
Yeah.
understand that we can't be handcuffed by things that handcuffs you and me, like law.
Yeah. Do you think that that mentality, uh, has survived and consistently, lives throughout in the ensuing decades, you think?
I'm thinking back to a speech that Mike Pompeo made at West Point after his term as head of the CIA, and he said, your honor code here at West Point is you may not lie, you may not cheat, you may not steal." And he said, "I ran the CIA. We lied, we cheated, we stole." Maybe that's not the official ethos of the CIA. I don't think they put that over their door. But that impulse, I think, does still exist. There is a sense inside, I think, all intelligence agencies that we know the real threats. Ordinary
Mhm.
people don't get it. And so that's why we are willing and able to approve projects that ordinary people would disapprove of.
Yeah.
They don't see what we see. And when you get into that mindset, you're naturally pulled to see things that you want to see, even if they're not there.
That's what kinda scares me a little bit. That's what I've been learning about. What caused you to jump into MK Ultra and Poisoner in Chief, departing from a lot of your previous work and a lot of the previous focus that you've had?
Well, you're right. A lot of my work in the past has been on the history of American intervention in other countries.
That's right.
So, in one of those books, when I was researching the overthrow that the CIA carried out, in which we overthrew the prime minister of the Congo
Mhm.
in 1960, that was Patrice Lumumba.
Yes.
I was writing about that episode, and one of the
Ah,
most notable features of that episode was that the CIA decided to kill. Um, Patrice Lumumba on orders from President Eisenhower. So the CIA wouldn't decide this on his own. Eisenhower wanted Lumumba killed.
that's on the record?
Yes.
Okay.
So the CIA was given this job, and then it went immediately to Gottlieb as the poisoner in chief. So in this little summary that I wrote about the Lumumba operation, I note that the CIA sent poison to the Congo
Mhm.
or to its station chief there for use in killing the prime minister. Now, that's pretty radical. I don't think there's ever been a time that I know of in American history where a government agency sent poison to another country to kill the leader of that country with whom we also have diplomatic relations. So I
Wow.
started asking myself after I finished that account, um, who would have carried that poison? Who somebody would have had to physically bring it to the Congo. So would that
Mhm.
have been some courier or somebody that specializes in that? Well, as I researched it, I found out no. The answer was it was Sidney Gottlieb. And then I began to realize that, as had been previously revealed, that Gottlieb was the person in charge of making all the poisons that we use to
Mm,
try to kill foreign leaders. All those pills for Fidel Castro. He made a poison that was supposed to kill Zhou Enlai. The little poison pills that we would give our spies in case they wanted to kill themselves. All of those would have been made by Gottlieb. So
yeah.
when he was later brought in to be questioned in front of a congressional committee, that's all he was asked about. He was asked about his
Mhm.
involvement in plots to assassinate foreign leaders. But I began to realize as I read through this that actually that was just tiny part of Gottlieb's job. And that wasn't important for Gottlieb because if he hadn't had that job, somebody else could have done it. You just
Yeah.
need a pharmacist to make poisons. And slowly I began to realize that actually interrogating Gottlieb about what he did to make poisons was a way of avoiding his big
Mhm.
project, which was
Mhm.
MK Ultra, and nobody asked him about that. So uh, I think there was a sense that making these poisons was the worst thing that Gottlieb ever did, but it wasn't. And
It's
so
so
once
far
I
from it.
realized that, I thought we missed the whole whatever story there was about Gottlieb. We missed it. That was
Yeah.
not the story. There's a whole other story untold. And one of my themes that runs through all my books is I like telling untold stories. I am someone that wants to look behind the curtain and see what actually goes on rather than what we think is going on.
Uh-huh.
So it was the it was the Lumumba plot that made me focus on Gottlieb as the maker of poisons, and that also made me realize that making poisons was not the real important part of his life, and that his real project was something that nobody knew about or had written about.
Incredible. What a crazy way to step into such a pile of crap, excuse my language, but, I mean, it's really crazy. Um, so interventionalism was primarily your wa wa was American interventionalism was primarily your focus until then. Are you still working on that now?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am about to publish another book in the fall about the history of U.S. intervention in, drumroll, Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
And I discover that we've been promoting war in Ukraine for 75 years. And that
Yeah.
is a real untold story. It's the last big untold spy versus spy story of the 20th century and 21st century. So
That's so exciting.
looking forward to
Congratulations.
that one. Yeah.
Wow, I can't wait. As soon as I finished this book and I saw the other books that you published, I ordered like 2 or 3 more. I was like, "Okay, I gotta see more about what this is about." That's Ukraine. What can I ask, what you think? I bought it's a very dense book, but Provoked by Scott Horton. Are you
Mhm.
familiar with that book?
I am. Yes.
And, does that are the themes that you guys write about relatively aligned in terms of
Yes.
Yeah,
So that is a book that is reacting to something my book also reacts to, which is how many times we heard the word unprovoked
yeah.
about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I really like that book. And there's a lot of information in
There's a
there,
lot there.
but I'm a scholarly researcher, and I have to tell you, there's one big problem with that book: no index.
Mm.
And although ordinary people may not think that's a big deal, for a researcher, it is a big deal. So I had to go through that book more or less page by page and make up my own little index on the side. But yes, that book is definitely one of the ones that lays the path towards the book that I'm going to be publishing in the fall.
Awesome. I'm so excited. Professor, Dr. Kinzer, it is such an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much for everything that you've done and your incredible writing and incredible research and incredible work. And it's an honor to talk with you today. Thank you.
Great. I enjoyed it. Thank
It
you.
was great speaking with you.